Assalamualaikum everyone. This is Haleema Aamir. We'll be going over paper one today. Since this is recorded, I don't think I need to wait for the students, so I guess we'll just move on. Just a little run through of what we'll be doing today. We will be going over a breakdown of what paper one is all about, a little recap of what's included in paper one, what you need to know, and then we will go over the specimen paper. If we have enough time, I'll go over another modified paper as well, but we'll start off with the specimen paper that we've been given for this year. All right. So if you have any questions, you can just ask your questions in the chat and I will try to go over as many as possible. All right. So first things first, let's go over a little breakdown of what paper one is all about and what basically is the major change that students need to expect as compared to what the previous past papers might show you in reference to paper one. All right. So basically, what they have done now is that your paper one, which is your reading paper, will be divided into two sections as it was earlier as well, which is your reading section, comprehension section, and then your summary section. Now, one major change is that section B is now section A, which is your comprehension section. So first off, you would have to go over a comprehension passage, which will basically test your ability to comprehend a given text, as well as how an author basically uses language effectively in order to convey a certain message or an idea to the reader. All right. So in this case, in section A, which is comprehension and use of language, you have question number one, which will be up to 16 marks. It could vary, but the division will be 25 marks for the entire section. So you will have your question number one, which is going to highlight the idea of short answer questions in which you will be questioned on your ability to understand explicit and implicit meanings. All right. That basically means what is directly mentioned within the text, if you're able to understand that. And once you read that text and once you highlighted the explicit ideas mentioned within the text, are you or are you not able to imply any ideas or infer any ideas that may or may not be associated with the text at hand? All right. We will be going over a list of command words as well through the specimen paper, which will help you understand exactly which questions are explicit questions and which questions are highlighted as implicit questions. The second question, which is your use of language question, is basically where you are expected to analyze the author's use of language. So you are basically expected to understand what the author is trying to imply through the statements that they have used, or what effect does the language hold within that context of those given lines. All right. So that is your question number one and question number two for section A. Then you have your section B, which talks about your summary writing skills, where you are expected to summarize one particular aspect of the passage. So keep in mind that the question does not ask you to summarize the entire passage as a whole. You're not summarizing the entire thing. You're summarizing one aspect of the given passage. So the question will clearly state what they expect you to summarize. So for example, if a text is talking about advantages, disadvantages, and current day use of technology, for example, the summary could pick out one aspect for this and ask you to summarize that. So make sure you read the question carefully for this one because they will highlight one particular aspect. One major change is the word limit in the summary section where you are not expected to exceed 150 words. So not a word more than 150. Other than that, one more change that you have here is that the section B will have an extra question, which we call the short response question. It's a 5-mark question where you are given a hypothetical situation based on the passage at hand, and you will be expected to respond as per the given scenario. So your task at hand would be to make sure that you understand the passage completely and then respond for this particular question. All right. So that's basically how the paper will be divided within sections. These are the questions that you should be expecting for your paper. Keep in mind that we do not write content points for the summary. So no note making this time. So you don't have to do that. You directly move on to your summary. So that is something that you are expected to keep in mind because the question clearly states that you write in continuous form. So if students do end up writing, the rough draft of the content points like earlier, that does, affect your mark as quite greatly. So keep in mind, you are not expected to make any notes, no rough drafts. You directly write your summary. So it's a 20-mark section where you directly write your summary and you will be tested on your ability to identify the content points as per the question, and then your use of language, whether you used the appropriate language that summarizes the text without any lift off from the text itself. So if you're able to rephrase, if you're able to club together ideas, like ideas, and at the same time, if you're able to cover all the content points within the given word limit, you're good to go. So this is a very scoring section. So the summary is basically the easiest section in the entire paper, and you are expected to follow the instructions to the T. And if you do so, you score quite well. All right, so this is the most scoring section of the paper. That being said, the best way to recap the skills for paper one, I believe, is through the specimen paper. So that's what we're going to go over today. The specimen paper followed by a modified paper. Do we have any questions so far, or do I move on? I guess we can. All right, so we will be going over the specimen paper. I will have both files side by side. So if you want, you can have this open for yourself as well. This is the 2024 1123 specimen paper. All right. So basically, the task at hand is that we should be able to identify. The first question basically focuses on the idea of explicit and implicit ideas. All right. What that basically means is that the first step for all students is to, number one, read through the question paper very, very carefully and make sure you are able to identify what the question asks you. So the command word in each question will help you identify whether you are expected to rephrase, whether you're expected to lift off from the text or not, or you're expected to infer any information on your own based on what you have read from the text. All right. So, for example, when we talk about command words, the first thing that you should always do before you start off your paper is read through the question paper and look out for those keywords that help you identify exactly what the question looks for. For example, if you look at the first question in which it says, in what way is the structure of redwood trees the opposite of most trees? They've given you a line number. That's something that should help you. You should know exactly where to look. However, it says what. So all what questions are basically asking you to simply highlight an idea associated with this given question. You're not expected to rephrase. You're not expected to work on this in your own words. And since it's a 1-mark question, so you won't be expected to write a lot either. So straightforward, lift off from the text, whatever information you think highlights the idea of how these trees may be opposite of most trees, you highlight that. So that's an explicit question. So the first thing that I ask my students to do is just read through the paper and highlight these keywords so that you know exactly what you need to do when you go to the passage for your answers. All right. The second question, for example, you can see that talks about using your own words. In your own word questions, this is where the examiner is going to look for students who are able to rephrase. So if you lift off in this question, that's where you lose marks. So you will not qualify for a mark if you lift off the right text. However, if you lift up the right text and you rephrase it, that's where you get the mark. So here it's an own word question. That means I am expected to write in my own words. I cannot lift off from the text. I cannot copy from the text. All right. And the third keyword that you can expect for the first question is give. In this case, you are expected to, again, lift from the text 2 features that would apply to this question. We'll go through all the answers together. So basically, these are the main 3 keywords that you will come across. Keep these in mind when you're reading so that you can highlight exactly what information you need to use for all of the questions. Once you've done that, make sure you recheck your keywords, your command words before you actually write your answer. Because if you do not do that, if you end up writing um, a lifted off or a copied answer for an own word question, no matter how correct that information is, you will not get a mark. So just keep these things in mind. They're small things, but they can actually affect your grade quite a lot. The next thing that we need to keep in mind are explain questions in which you are expected to highlight a certain additional information associated with the question itself. Moving forward, these are the main keywords that you would expect in question number one. All right, so we're going to go over question number one first, and then move on to what implicit meanings are and talk about question number two with that. All right, so for example, when we talk about the first question, which highlighted the idea of how redwood trees, in what way is the structure of redwood trees the opposite of most trees? This is a question from line 2. So keep in mind, they give you line numbers for a reason. The best strategy to go over the reading paper is, since we have a lot of time, it's always a good idea to use that to our advantage. The first thing that I would suggest is quickly read through the paper, read through the passage, and formulate an idea of what the overall tone and message behind the passage is. So once you've done that, once you've identified exactly what the passage is going to be about, the next step is to begin skimming through the questions and the lines that they have given for the questions. All right. So in this case, for example, when they are talking about in what way is the structure of redwood trees the opposite of most trees, it refers to redwood trees somewhere here in the second line, talking about how the structure of redwood trees, any redwood tree, is the opposite of most trees, whose branches get smaller towards the top. So in this case, we are basically talking about how the redwood trees have smaller branches compared to other trees. All right. So the question here tricks the student by asking them, in what way is the structure of redwood trees the opposite? So that's what we have to basically talk about here in reference to other trees. So either we highlight the idea that they are either this section right here, talking about how the branches are smaller. So there's two ways we can answer this. Either we say that the branches do not get smaller towards the top of other trees, or in this case, the branches get larger towards the top of the tree for the redwood tree. So this is something that you need to clarify exactly what branches you're talking about. If you just mention a tree, then that's again going to be something that is going to be considered as an incomplete answer. So this is something that you need to be very careful with. The structure of the question may be something that asks you the opposite of what the text says. So something that's implied but directly mentioned within the text at the same time. All right. So keep in mind, whatever the words of the question ask you, that has to be catered. So in this case, if they're talking about the structure of redwood trees, you talk about how the structure of redwood trees in this case talks about branches that are smaller towards the top, do not get smaller towards the top, or get larger towards the top. So just be careful with how you phrase that. All right. Another answer that you can include here would talk about the idea of how it is a complicated structure of branches or it is massive. So you can rephrase the word. You do not need to, but if you do so, that's fine. Whereas the next question asks us to talk about what the text means by ancient giant of the forest in line 3, but we need to explain this in our own words. So the question at hand basically asks us to talk about how the text identifies the forest as something that is an ancient giant. Now, in this case, if you look at the question, this is a 2-mark question. So keep in mind the question mark is actually going to help you identify how much information you should mention. So if it's a 2-mark question, then the question likely asks you for two things. So in this case, we need to identify exactly what two words or phrases or ideas we can pick out from the given line. So if you look at the line, it says ancient giant of the forest. So we can identify that there are two words I can explain in my own words. The idea of what ancient means in this case, in this context, and the idea of what the word giant implies for the redwood forest. So in this case, in line 3, it talks about how this ancient giant of the forest grew increasingly complicated and more massive higher off the ground. So in this case, this is talking about the entire forest of how this is something that is ancient and giant. So you're expected to rephrase these two words and highlight what these two words mean in the context in your own words. So you would basically talk about how the word ancient could be rephrased in our own words to something that is very old or something that has aged quite a lot. So, in our own words, whatever we use to highlight the idea of what ancient means in this context, that gets us 1 mark. And then we also need to highlight what the word giant means. Since we're referring to the idea of trees here, we would want to use words such as massive, huge, or very tall. So the word very tall would work very well with the idea of how we're talking about very old and very tall trees that make up this forest. All right. So as long as you've mentioned these two words, which are rephrased from what the text says in your own words, you get the mark. All right. So please keep in mind that the context matters quite a lot. In this case, if the text is talking about the forest, make sure that whatever you use as your response in this case highlights the idea of what the text actually talks about. So since we're talking about trees, we can talk about how it is very tall. That would be the perfect synonym in this case. And that gets you the 2 marks. The next thing says, give two features of the enormous trunk of the nameless that would make it difficult to begin to climb this particular tree. So this is from lines 5 to 9, where they talk about how there are certain features associated with the tree itself, which make it very difficult to climb. So in this case, we need to make sure that we do not identify the incorrect piece of information. When they give you multiple lines as reference, this is your sign to look out for misguided information as well. So if you read lines 5 to 9, you'll notice that they describe quite a lot about the trees. But we need to identify the particular feature that makes it difficult to climb and not any other feature whatsoever. So if you read the lines, it says the tree was about 100 meters tall with a diameter of 3 meters near its base. The trunk was an enormous cylinder of soft, crumbly bark. Far above the ground, a few small, wispy branches popped out of the trunk, but there were no branches on its lower reaches. Higher up still, a tangle of limbs emerged and wandered out of sight, buried in clouds of foliage. Mo and Marwood couldn't see its top. Now, in this case, there are a lot of details that we could pick out that make anyone think that this is about the tree, so this is something that we can highlight. Keep in mind that they're talking about what makes it difficult to begin the climb. So not just the idea of climbing the tree, but the idea of how beginning the climb itself is very difficult. So we need to talk about how the initial process is very difficult, not just the entire process of climbing this tree. So if you identify the idea of how there's an enormous cylinder, this would be incorrect. You do not talk about how the trunk is enormous. However, if we do talk about the idea of how the base is rather thick at the beginning, that is something that could work. If we talk about the idea of how you could say the overall structure or the overall bark itself is soft and crumbly, that could work because obviously that implies that it's very difficult to grab on to the branches itself. Another idea that we could associate with this answer could be the idea of how there were no branches in its lower reach. So basically, towards the bottom of the tree, there aren't any branches, but then towards the top, there's quite a massive mesh of branches. So basically, this is what makes beginning the climb very difficult. So since our keyword highlights the idea of what the beginning of the climb is like and how that's difficult, we will highlight two things. Number one, the overall structure where it is very soft and crumbly, the bark itself, and how there aren't many branches to actually latch onto towards the beginning of the climb. All right. So basically, just keep in mind it's a give question, so we do not need to rephrase. We simply pick up these two pieces of information and add it to the question. It's a 2-mark questions, that means we need to make sure we mention both. If you only mention one, you only get 1 mark. But since the size itself does not matter in how difficult the beginning of the climb is, so you will not be highlighting the idea of how the enormous cylinder is there. All right. So keep in mind that the question needs to highlight exactly what the question asks. So do not include any information that does not fall for a checklist for all key words. The next question, another give question, talks about how you are expected to give 2 details that show the relentless speed, line 18, with which a redwood tree can grow according to the text. So again, since this is a give question, we will simply pick out 2 details from the text that tell us about the relentless speed. So the first thing that we need to understand is, what does the word relentless speed mean? This is basically talking about how quickly this tree grows or perhaps does not grow. So in line 18, it talks about how if it is hit by light, it once again grows with relentless speed. Nameless had clearly basked in light, it was huge. So basically, the idea of how light affects its speed is something that they are talking about in this case, asking you to give 2 details that show the relentless speed with which a redwood tree can grow according to the text. So within this entire in this section right here, we're basically trying to highlight how we can see that this is something that grows very, very quickly. All right. So the first detail that we can definitely pick out, let's go through the entire passage. I would recall that in ideal conditions, a redwood can grow from a seed into a tree that's an astonishing 16 meters tall. Something that highlights that within the first 20 years of life. So the word astonishing tells us that this is not something usual. So this is a piece of information that I can include in my answer, talking about how within the first 20 years of its life, it has grown so much. So this again highlights the speed, increasing in height by nearly a meter annually. After that, it grows faster still. So whatever information they're trying to highlight, the idea of how it continues to grow. So again, that's something we can include within our response. Adding mass at an accelerating rate, it can exceed 75 centimeters in diameter at chest height in fewer than 60 years. So the way this has been highlighted of how the idea of how within 60 years, this tree grows a diameter of 75 centimeters. This is something that they're talking about, how it is growing faster still. So this is our second piece of information that I can include, that the diameter reaches about 75 centimeters and more within the first 60 years. So if you just talk about how the diameter is 75 centimeters, that will not cut it. You do need to mention that this is within this particular time period. So in both responses, in both pieces of evidence, do make sure that you mention the years, because that is what shows its speed in this case. The growth of redwood trees generally slows down after the first 100 years, so definitely not something I'd want to include. Through by the age of 800, they may have reached a height as tall as a 30-story building. Now, if I only choose this piece of information, that might work, talking about how within 800 years, it is as tall as a 30-story building. So that piece of information I can include, but the entire passage, the entire phrase over here, talking about is generally slowing down after the first 100 years, that's not something I'd include. In deep shade of their elders, where a few other trees would survive, don't need that. A small redwood living in deep shade hardly grows at all, but doesn't die. So again, an idea of how light impacts its relentless speed. Since the question is talking only about the speed, we do not talk about the conditions in our answer, and only mention 2 things. The first one being that its height would reach about 16 meters in just the first 20 years of life. So that's one piece of information I do not need to rephrase. Second would be talking about how it can exceed 75 centimeters in diameter in fewer than the first 60 years of life. So these 2 pieces of information, as lifted off from the text, will give us 2 marks. Moving forward, this is an explain question, but keeping in mind the fact that this is a 1-mark question, we only pick out 1 piece of information for the text for this question. And that information needs to highlight, explain what Mo is thinking when he looked again at the lowest branch of a smaller tree standing next to nameless, line 22. So this is an implicit question where they're expecting you to try and understand what he is possibly thinking based on the context at hand. So line 22 basically says, Mo looked again at the lowest branch of a smaller tree standing next to the nameless. Without warning, he leapt, grabbed, and swung himself up onto the branch in one fluid movement and began climbing upwards. Now, this question basically highlights or tests you on your ability to understand exactly what's going on in this part of the passage. So basically, if you haven't read the passage carefully and don't understand or are not able to comprehend exactly what the context of this particular line is, you won't be able to answer this question. So the question says, what is he thinking? The context here is to talk about how he is trying to climb up the nameless, right? So looking at the lines right before this, you aren't going to try to climb it, are you? Asked Marwood. So basically, the idea of climbing is what's going on through his mind. So we link this line, which we have been given within the question, to the information that was highlighted right before to give us a context of what he could possibly be thinking. So in this case, when it says, explain what Mo is thinking when he looked again at the lowest branch of a smaller tree standing next to the nameless. So basically, what he could possibly be thinking here is the idea of whether or not he can use this branch in order to climb up nameless. Now, this is an implied question. The only way you would be able to answer this if you are reading through the entire passage and making sure that you understand the context of the given text. All right. So here you simply highlight the idea of Mo is probably thinking about whether or not he would be able to climb up the nameless using this branch. The next question talks about how does Mo feel about trying to climb the nameless. So this basically is a two-part question. We have 3 marks here. So we should be able to identify number 1, his feelings for 1 mark, and then give 2 details from the text to support your answer. So you should be able to highlight 2 pieces of evidence to support your answer. Please keep in mind that this is how the question will be structured in your paper as well. A lot of students get confused with how to actually divide their answer into 2 parts since it's a 2-part question. There's a 1 and there's a part 2. So keep in mind that this is what you're supposed to highlight the first one on. So the first answer goes here, where you highlight how does Mo feel about trying to climb the nameless in lines 22 to 34. I really don't think that's very smart, Marwood warned from below. 10 minutes later, Mo arrived at the top of the smaller tree. The tree had narrowed to a pole thinner than his wrist and began swaying under his weight. Having got as high as he could go, Mo looked across at Nameless and spotted a spray of slender branches on the carving wall of its monstrous trunk. A little branch stuck out directly in front of him. Mo wanted to grab that branch. He edged closer to it, and the smaller tree began to bend under his weight. So we need to keep in mind that we are trying to imply what he could possibly be feeling when he's going through this entire process of trying to climb the tree. There was a gap between the branch of the smaller tree and Nameless. From the ground, Mo hadn't noticed that gap, expecting that the little tree's branches touched the big tree's branches, providing a bridge to walk across. Mo studied the situation. If he could just reach out far enough, he might be able to grab that little branch on Nameless. So the way that he is going about the entire process, regardless of the fact that the little tree is not something that can hold his weight, it shows us that he is not someone who is going to give up, because this shows us that he is very optimistic about the entire climbing process. So we will talk about how he is very determined, excited, confident, enthusiastic. He is facing this challenge. So anything along those lines, if you highlight the idea of how he's feeling optimistic, or he's feeling very positive about the fact that he thinks he is going to be able to climb this tree, you should get a mark. So in any case, as long as you highlight the idea of how he is feeling very determined, or how he is feeling positive. So anything along those lines in your own words, to highlight how he feels very excited to do so. So anything that highlights his positive feelings towards the idea of climbing, how he's not getting scared, of the entire process gets you the mark. All right, so we could also use the word confident here. So anything along those lines that highlights the idea of how he is feeling positive. So it's a positive feeling. Anything that highlights that gets you the mark. So in any feeling question, one little trick that I could say you could use in any of these feeling questions, because later on, question number 2 may be aate hain questions. So one thing that you could do is first highlight, is it a positive feeling that you associated with the idea of the text or a negative one? And then find synonyms that fit best for that scenario. So the first thing you should be able to identify is whether or not it's a positive feeling, and then find a synonym that works best in the context. So if you do that, you are 50% through the process of deciding what the feeling should possibly be. The next part of the question says, give 2 details from the text to support your answer. So anything from the text that tell me that he is very confident about this, or he's very optimistic or determined that he is going to make it through. So this says to support your answer, but it has to be from the text. Now, since it doesn't give me any line numbers whatsoever, this can be from anywhere in the text. So keep in mind that if the question highlights a specific section of the text, then that's where the evidence should be from. However, if it just says from the text, you can pick anything from the entire passage. So for example, if we talk about how here it says, Mo arrived at the top of the smaller tree. Oh, over here, this line. Mo looked again at the lowest branch of a smaller tree standing next to the nameless. Without warning, he leapt, grabbed, and swung himself up onto the branch in one fluid movement. So the word fluid here, the word without warning, shows us that he is number one determined and he is eager or excited to do what he is about to do. So this could be one thing that I could include in this evidence here. Another detail that we could talk about would be how 10 minutes later, he arrived at the top of the smaller tree. So this again shows us that he keeps trying to climb the tree itself. The idea of how he looked across at Nameless and spotted a spray of slender branches on the curving wall of its monstrous trunk. So this idea shows us that he is not giving up. He's looking for ways. This detail right here shows us that he's actually trying to find ways in order to be able to climb the Nameless. So this again shows us that he's relentless. He is trying his best to climb the Nameless. So this again shows us that this person is trying to optimistically climb the Nameless. So these are 3 details out of which you pick out any 2, and you could get a 3 out of 3 for this question. Moving forward, now this is an implicit question. During his climb, Mo discovered a problem which he had not seen when he was on the ground. What was this problem? So this is a straightforward question trying to ask us what was the problem that he faced. Now, if you look at the idea of how they talk about how there was a gap between the trees. He initially thought that when he was on the ground, he thought that once he climbs up the smaller tree, it says so right here in line 32. Expecting that the little tree's branches touched the big tree's branches, providing a bridge to walk across. So this basically highlights the idea of how he expected it to be a bridge. The fact that the word expected is used here, that means it's something that he thought would happen, but probably did not in this case. Mo studied the situation. If he could just reach out far enough, he might be able to grab that little branch on Nameless. So it's basically trying to highlight the idea of how he basically expected it to go a certain way, but clearly the word expected shows us that it's not what happened. So if you highlight the idea of how he expected it to bridge over, but there was a gap, that gets you a mark. So you do not need to rephrase since it's a what question. All what questions mean that you do not need to rephrase. You can just pick out information from the text and highlight that within your answer. Second part says, what did Mo decide to do to solve the problem? So again, moving forward, what was his solution to the problem? So he basically thought that if he could just get reach out far enough. So his solution to the problem was that he would try and reach out or jump from one end to the other. All right. So that's what you would mention here, that his solution was, or he thought that he could solve this problem by jumping over from one tree to the other or trying to reach out far enough. So he's basically either going to try and grab it or he's going to try and jump towards it. So both answers would work in this case. Last one, explain using your own words. Now, in this case, we are not just expected to use our own words, but we are expected to include details as well in our own words, highlighting Marwood's different feelings about Mo's climbing nameless. Give three details from anywhere in the text to support your answer. Now, this question basically highlights Marwood's feelings in this case. So we're not talking about Mo, we're talking about three various or three distinct feelings or opinions that Marwood, the other character, holds throughout the process of Mo trying to climb the nameless. So in this case, the first thing that you need to keep in mind is, like I said, if it's a feeling question, the first thing that we try to highlight is this spectrum of feelings positive or negative? And then we try to find the words that we can associate with this answer. And then, because it's an on-word question, we will not highlight these feelings in just um, those words mentioned within the text, but we will try to explain it as well. So keep in mind, this is a 3-mark question. They're not testing you on simply those three feelings, those three words. Look at the number of lines, look at the word explain, look at the word use your own words. This basically means the examiner expects you to write a proper detailed response, highlighting how Marwood experiences these different feelings in order to convey what he feels about Mo climbing the nameless. All right. So the first evidence that we can talk about in this case is when Marwood says these lines right here. You aren't going to climb it, are you? So in this case, we can highlight the idea of how Mo does not quite believe the fact that Marwood does not believe that Mo would actually climb it. So he's probably amazed. The word incredulously again talks about how at first Marwood is simply amazed or is shocked or is not quite convinced that this is something Mo is going to do. So the first feeling that we can highlight at first is the idea of how it is amazed, but we need to make sure that we highlight the fact that it is the first feeling that Marwood has. However, the next detail that we can pick out is this idea right here. It says, I don't think that's very smart, Marwood warned from below. So in this case, we can talk about how the word warned talks about or could highlight the idea that Marwood does not think that this is the right thing to do. So Marwood probably doesn't agree with this idea. So again, the word very smart, the fact that Marwood is saying, I don't think that that's very smart, highlights the idea that Marwood doesn't agree. So according to Marwood, this isn't a good idea. This is not something that Mo should do. So since this is a warning, this could probably highlight feelings such as the idea of how Marwood is probably, so the synonyms could include anything like nervous. We could talk about how Marwood probably feels worried. So definitely not something that Marwood agrees with. So scared as well is something that we could use. So all of the synonyms that come to your mind, pick one and highlight that because you are, again, using your own words. Moving forward, now there's quite a lot of feelings that Marwood shares when it comes to the idea of Mo trying to climb the tree. Now, over here, look at this. It says, I can't watch, Marwood shouted furiously from below and closed his eyes. So the word furiously shows us that Marwood now is not just worried or shocked or scared, but also angry with Mo for doing this. So this is basically a spectrum of feelings associated with how Marwood feels about this particular process of climbing the nameless. So keep in mind that the feelings are a spectrum. They're basically something that escalate, right? So in this case, start from the beginning, pick out the feeling, and then talk about how this feeling changes throughout the text. Anything text that you're given and any question that highlights a spectrum of feelings like such, you can rest assured that the question is trying to highlight the idea of how, through the passage, the feelings are changing. So they will begin at one level and then they will either escalate or change into something else. So if you're given a 3 mark question highlighting the details about someone's feelings within the text, you have to basically talk about how these feelings are changing. So it starts off with something and towards the end it changes. There are more details that we can actually highlight. For example, after the idea of how uh, Marwood closes his eyes, shows us that Marwood does not quite believe that this is possible. So, not very pessimistic about it, very certain that this will go wrong. Okay, so basically keep in mind that as long as you highlight your keywords, the command words for question number 1, you should be able to score a perfect 16 or whatever the score says. All right, so keep in mind that the keywords matter quite a lot for the first question because you're basically trying to highlight information that the question is trying to manipulate out of you, your understanding of what the text explicitly mentions along with what ideas can you associate or imply based on what you have read. All right. That being said, the second section that is going to be highlighted within your section A, which is question number 2. Now, this is a use of language question. This is where the examiner expects you to be able to not just comprehend what the text is trying to say, but also try and imply or try and decipher what the use of language basically holds as an effect towards what the author is trying to say. All right. So you're basically trying to understand how the use of language is conveying a certain message. For example, if you are asked to, let's look at the first question. Read this extract from the text. He felt gravity go to zero. The world stopped. Mo watched the branch of the large redwood approach in slow motion and saw his fingers extend towards it. That's lines 45 to 46. What does the writer want to suggest to us about the situation at this point in the story? Keep in mind that the question will be formulated or phrased within this section like so. So keep in mind that they're asking you about what the situation is like. What would you describe the situation as at this particular point in the story? So keep in mind that this basically means that you are not only just trying to highlight what's happening, but you're trying to highlight the idea of how this particular phrase is trying to highlight the situation at this point. So the best way to do that would be to highlight or to come up with an adjective that you would use to describe this entire this phrase. So whatever adjective comes to mind once you read this phrase is a good response to talk about what the writer wants to suggest about the situation at this point. So for example, if we read this line, we can talk about how the world stopped. This shows us that it is something that is rather drastic or dramatic. If we talk about how he felt gravity go to zero, this shows us that he himself is feeling a certain way. So one phrase or adjective that you could use to describe how he feels like this is a very tense situation gets you the mark. So for example, if I were to say that in this case, he's not just scared or worried, but he is being rather dramatic about it. So it is a very tense moment for him. So that is something that we could say it's a tense moment. If we highlight the way this tense moment is spoken of, we can also say that it's very dramatic for him. We can also highlight how it's a very critical moment, if that's a word that comes to mind. So basically, the idea here is the situation at this point. So just this particular moment, not the entire passage, not the overall situation, but just this particular point in the story. So it's a 1 mark question, so one phrase should cut it. The next question says, explain why the writer uses the word stronger rather than strong in this expression, a stronger branch. Now, this is from line 49. So the best way to answer a question like this would be to talk about the entire phrase, read the entire phrase, and identify what difference would it make in the overall meaning of the phrase if you replace the word stronger with the word strong. So replace the word there. For this question, when they're asking you why one word was used over the other, the best way to answer this question is to first look at the line, replace the words. Check whether the replaced phrase makes a difference in the overall meaning of what this phrase says. So, for example, if we look at line 49, it says that he got himself over the trunk and climbed the next 3 precarious meters onto a stronger branch. So, if I were to talk about this particular phrase and replace stronger with strong, the first thing that you need to ask yourself, how does this change the meaning of the overall phrase? And that's basically what you need to highlight within your response for this question, where they're asking you to explain why the word stronger was used. So the word stronger is basically a comparative adjective. So instead of saying that he looked for a strong branch in general, the author is basically trying to highlight the idea that he looked for branches that were strong enough to hold his weight. So keeping in mind the idea that within the overall text, they are talking about how there's a various, you could say, quality of branches that he has in front of him. So in this case, the word stronger is actually trying to associate or link together the idea that he is basically trying to look for something that is strong enough or safe enough for him to climb. So you are basically going to be awarded your mark, keeping in mind that you are not only trying to highlight the fact that it should be a branch that's strong, but one that is stronger than those around him. All right. So keeping that in mind, we have to understand that the text is trying to talk about how Mo is looking for a branch that is safe enough, that won't break once he climbs onto it. So since it says explain, we will explain by saying that he is looking for a branch that is safe to carry his weight, or the idea of how it is strong enough in comparison to the branches around him. So that is something that you need to talk about. Since this is comparative, so we're talking about how the branches need to be comparatively stronger than those around him, all right, or be able to support his weight. So anything along those lines should give you the mark. What two impressions does the writer want to convey to the reader in the sentence? There was foliage everywhere, above, below, and on all sides, layer upon layer of leaves, like tents within tents. So there are basically two impressions within the text that he is trying to talk about in this particular statement. So when he is talking about lines 51 to 52, for questions like this, a good way to go would be to try and read through a few lines before and after to try and get a little gist of what the context is for the given lines. So basically here, this is talking about lines 51 onwards. So it says branches here were bigger and closer together. There was foliage everywhere, above, below, and on all sides, layer upon layer of leaves like tents within tents. The tree hadn't looked so big from the ground. So he's basically trying to highlight something that is very different from what he saw earlier, right? So since it's talking about two impressions, we can highlight how the first thing that he talks about is the idea of leaves. So whatever this implies, that could be my first impression. How we rephrase that, I'll talk about that in a minute. And also how we can also talk about how the branches here were bigger and closer together, like tents within tents. So basically, he's not just talking about how there's quite a lot of leaves, but how they overlap one another. So we go back to the question, which says two impressions does the writer want to convey to the reader in the sentence? There was foliage everywhere. So he's basically trying to say the word everywhere is trying to highlight how he was surrounded by greenery or leaves in this case. That's the first impression that we can talk about. So the word everywhere can help us understand that he is surrounded by something. The second impression that this statement could give us is the fact that there was no space for him within this, you could say, thickness of leaves. So it's not just the fact that there are leaves everywhere, but there are quite a lot of leaves everywhere. So it's not just a layer of leaves that covers him, surrounds him, but a quite thick layer of leaves. So talking about how he's, number one, completely surrounded by leaves, that would be my first impression. So he's completely surrounded. My second impression could highlight the idea of how he's not just surrounded by leaves, but he's surrounded by a very, very thick layer, or you could say covered with. So those two impressions within the statement highlight the idea of how not the fact that there are leaves everywhere, but the fact that there are leaves everywhere. Number one, surrounding him. Secondly, how the layer of leaves are not just there, but quite obviously there. It's a very thick layer of leaves. Moving forward, the next question says, read this sentence from the text, climbing upwards slowly and steadily through the labyrinth. Mo lost sight of the ground. What effect does the writer suggest about the tree by using the word labyrinth to describe it? Now, this is basically the question that we need to discuss in a little bit of detail, because not all of you may know what the word labyrinth means. All right. And if you come across a word such as this one within your passage, what do you do? All right. So I'm not going to tell you what this word means, but instead I'm going to tell you exactly how to go through this question in case you do not know what this word means. The first thing that we need to do is we read the statement, climbing upward slowly and steadily through the labyrinth, Mo lost sight of the ground. So they're asking me to highlight what effect the writer suggests about the tree by using this word. So this word is creating some impact about the tree itself. So how does this word describe the tree? That's what the question says. Now, I don't know what the word labyrinth means. What do? I go back to the passage and I look at the line given to me, which is line 54. It says, climbing upward slowly and steadily through the labyrinth, Mo lost sight of the ground. It felt as if he was passing through a membrane and entering another world. So if I do not know what this word means, I will look at the context. I will see how this word overall generally describes the entire tree at this point within the text. So I will look at the context. And since it's talking about something that he is going through, the tree hadn't looked so big from the ground. So he's trying to highlight something that looks very different now that he's seeing it up close. And then it says, climbing upward slowly and steadily through the labyrinth, he lost sight of the ground. So the way this labyrinth, whatever this word may mean, is highlighting the tree in reference to how it is something that is making him lose sight of the ground. That means once he has crossed this labyrinth, he is unable to see the ground. That means it is significant enough to make him either lose sight of the ground or cover the surrounding enough so that he cannot see the ground. So the first thing that we can comprehend of what this word would possibly mean is the fact that it is something that is big enough or significantly there enough so that he cannot see the ground anymore. So there's so many branches that he cannot see the ground anymore. So even if I do not know what the word labyrinth of branches means, I can still highlight the idea that since he's climbing through branches and he's using the word labyrinth to describe how once he has climbed through, he cannot see the ground. That means there's so many of them. So the idea of how the structure of these branches is rather extensive or something very difficult to go through because he is climbing slowly and steadily through this. He is unable to see the ground. So as long as I highlight this idea, I should be able to get a mark. All right. So since this is a 2-mark question, we need to describe how this word basically tries to highlight the idea that the branches are not just there, but they are there in a very complex, or you could say a very confusing pattern, because of which he had to go through them very slowly. And so they were, and the fact that they were so complex that he wasn't able to see the ground once he had crossed them. So these are the two ideas that I would associate when describing the word or the effect that the word labyrinth creates to describe the branches. Now, for those who do know the word labyrinth, it basically means something that is kind of like a maze, a very complex structure. So in this case, the word labyrinth is used to describe the tree itself, not just to highlight how it's a very big tree, but the fact that it is, number one, a very complex structure, and the fact that it is very confusing. Why? Because he had to, if you look at the entire text, the way he's climbing these branches in this particular tree, you notice the details actually highlight this idea beforehand as well, talking about how he needs to think before he takes every step, because he needs to make sure that he picks the right path in order to climb up. So this again shows us that it's kind of like a puzzle that he is trying to solve. So that is basically the effect or the idea that this word itself is trying to highlight within this part of the passage, trying to talk about how, number one, the overall structure of the branches or the way the branches are laid out, or the branches of the tree in general are very elaborate or very extensive. Number one, talking about how it is very confusing for him. So I'm using the simplest words that I can think of here. So even if you can't come up with the extremely complex words, as long as you highlight the idea that this is the effect that it creates, you're good to go. So it's basically trying to highlight how it's very difficult to find his way through it. And once he does, he is, not able to see a clear way through, because it says that he can't see the ground. So that means it's so complex, it's so intertwined that he can't see the ground after he climbs these branches. So this is basically how you can break apart one phrase in order to imply certain impressions or infer ideas based on how the overall context of this text works. Moving forward. Now, this is the last question of question number 2, which is basically introducing another command word, which says identify. Now, in your identify questions, you are simply expected to pick out one piece of information from the given text. This basically means that you are not simply rephrasing or anything. You are just picking out, this is a lift-off question, so you identify. The word identify in this case I will go over your questions in just a minute. I'm on the last question. So once I've just gone through this one, I'll go over the chat as well. All right. Okay, so the word identify basically means that you simply select or name a piece of evidence or a word or an example, in this case from the text. So this says identify one example from the text below of how the writer uses language effectively to convey Mo's feelings after Mo has lost sight of the ground. Now, in this case, how is language helping you understand what Mo feels? All right. So the best way to answer this question would be, number one, read through the given lines. Since this is highlighting this section alone, let's just look at the question paper. The first thing that you need to do in an effective language question is, first of all, try to understand the overall context of the given example. So these lines say, it felt as if he was passing through a membrane and entering another world. His senses were overwhelmed by an impression of life all around, flaky gray-green and brownish plants in all manner of shapes hung from branches, drippy, frizzy, stringy, and hairy. He began picking pieces off, tucking them into his pocket. As he neared the upper surface of the redwood canopy, the lacework of branches glowed with varied shades of green, and he broke out into the sunlight. So the first thing that we need to identify here is one example that helps us understand what Mo is feeling right now. Okay, so there are a number of examples that we can identify talking about what his experience at this point is like. So the first thing you should do is, since they're asking us to highlight what he feels, find an example. If within your example, you believe that the author has used language effectively to convey that feeling, you explain that and you get your mark. All right. So there are usually numerous examples that you can identify. For example, in this case where it says that it felt as if he was passing through a membrane. All right. So that could be my first example, talking about how this experience overall is something that he feels like he is passing through a barrier and entering something very, very new, because it says and entering another world. So he basically is experiencing something new. That's the first example that we can identify. The second one that we could talk about is the word overwhelmed. So he says that his senses were overwhelmed. So the idea of how within this he is not just seeing something different or smelling something different, but all of his senses are being catered to in this case, because he is not just observing something that is very new to him, but the entire experience is, making all of his senses feel overwhelmed. So that's another example that we can identify. The way the overall surroundings have been described, the adjectives used. So this could be effective language trying to highlight how he is feeling various textures around him. So that's a feeling that he's experiencing. And at the same time, the author uses a variety of adjectives to describe that. So that's effective use of language. Talking about lacework of branches. Now, this is a literary device that the author has used. The author has basically tried to not just talk about how the branches crisscrossed over one another. Instead of saying that, he used the word lacework to identify or to make the reader imagine the intricate design of a lace. And then the word that he uses, glowed with varied shades of green. So he's not just talking about how it was green, he is trying to talk about how there's a spectrum of colors that he observes. So he feels overwhelmed by sight. So all of these examples can be identified. Since we have been asked to identify only one, we pick out one of these examples and we explain in our own words how the author is basically trying to create an effect that he is not just feeling excited, he is feeling overwhelmed. This entire experience is something that is very adventurous for him. Or we could try and highlight the idea of how he is not just experiencing something that he has never experienced before, but he's experiencing it to his, the fullest extent he could. Talking about how it is something that he has never seen before. It is unidentified for him. He is going over a lot of different sensations, or talking about how he is seeing so many different colors in a setting that he has never seen before. All of these examples have something that you can associate as an explanation to what he's experiencing. So, as long as you highlight that example and then you explain it in your own words on how you think that this impression is basically creating that overall impact for Mo. So, if we say that he's feeling overwhelmed or excited, or he is basically going over an adventure, or this is something that he is exploring for the first time. So, if I say that he is passing through a membrane and entering another world, if this example is what I highlight, I can talk about how he is not just going through something that is dangerous, but also adventurous for him. And so, something that is very different, something that he has never experienced before. So, if I highlight that, that's a good explanation to what I have mentioned. Just one thing that I would like to point out, since it's a 3-mark question, you get 2 marks for your explanation, 1 mark for identifying your example. So you just pick out whatever part of this given section is your example, and then you, as is, write it down. So over here, you don't need to use your own words. You just pick it out and you quote your example. Before I move on and talk about the summary section, I'm just going to quickly go over the chat. Arusha, can you please highlight what question are you referring to here? Moving upward in moderate speed through the unknown, he could not see the ground below. Which question is this in reference to?
Ma'am, it's D part of question number 1.
Question 1D. All right, I'm just going to quickly go through to the question. Just a second. Okay, so the idea of relentless speed. No, so the second one that you have talked about, you're talking about 1D, right? The details that show relentless speed, line 18, with which a redwood tree can grow. So the fact that you're talking about, okay, moving upward in moderate speed through the unknown, this is actually referring to the speed that Mo was using when he climbed. So this is in reference to Mo. And the second one, he could not see the ground below. So you will need to highlight how the branches itself are very intricate. And keep in mind that it has to be close to the given lines itself. So if you highlight this from within or close to line 18, that would actually make more sense. So two details about the tree, not the way Mo was climbing the tree, because we're talking about how the relentless speed of the redwood tree as something that grows in light.
I'm sorry, ma'am. That was question number two, part D.
2D. Okay, yeah, that makes
Yeah.
more sense.
Yes.
All right. Okay. 2D. Read the sentence from the text climbing upward slowly and steadily through the labyrinth. He lost sight. Okay. So basically, you need to highlight what the effect for the word labyrinth is. Talking about how he could not see the ground below because the branches were very intricate, that will get you a mark. The first one talking about how he is moving at a moderate speed through the unknown, you need to highlight what you mean by this. So, okay, so the question here is trying to actually talk about not just the fact that it is something that is a very complex structure that he's climbing through, but the fact that it is something that is very maze-like. Okay, so do you know? Did you generally know what the word labyrinth meant?
No, ma'am. I just
No.
guessed it.
Okay.
No.
All right. So in this case, when you do not know what the word means, try to highlight what the context of the line is. When it's talking about how he is climbing very slowly and steadily through the labyrinth, he lost sight of the ground. So something that makes him lose sight, that means it's thick enough that he cannot see the ground after he climbs above it. Does that much make sense?
Yes.
Yes. So basically, if you're saying that he could not see the ground below, extend this by saying as he climbed through the complex or the dense structure of the branches. So the word dense will get you a little closer to the effect that it's trying to create. So the word labyrinth is basically, it basically means maze-like, right? Something that's like a maze or like a puzzle. But something, if you do not know what the word labyrinth actually means, another thing that you could highlight is that it was overall a very complex structure. There were a lot of branches that were intertwining one another. So much so that he couldn't see the ground after he climbed them. So even if I don't know what the word labyrinth means, in the general context of this line, I can tell that it is so dense, there are so many branches that he cannot see the ground after he climbs it. So make sure that you highlight that. So in order to get that mark, you need to highlight how he's not just climbing through this unknown structure and so much so that he can't see the ground. Explain why he can't see the ground. What is the tree like which makes him not see the ground? That's what you need to highlight because it says effect. What effect is this overall word trying to create? So even if you don't know what the word labyrinth means, explain what the overall effect is in this case. That it is so complex or so dense that he cannot see the ground. That's the effect that the word labyrinth is trying to create. That it is so dense, so confusing, and so intense कि उसको ground ही नहीं नजर आ रहा नीचे. Make sense now?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. All right. So
Ma'am,
that
there
does
is
it
one
for
more
the
question.
GG.
Uh, it is question number one, part H.
Okay.
The three
1H.
feelings of
Okay.
Margaret. My
Mhm.
question is, how am I going to explain the feeling of Margaret? Not the
Okay.
feeling,
So
sorry. uh, इसकी एग्जाम्पल को एक्सप्लेन करवाना है।
Basically, you first identify the example in this case. And once you have done that, you describe what that actually means. Okay, let me just go through the question real quick. It says, using your own words, Marwood's different feelings about Mo climbing the names. So so the first thing that you need to identify here is give three details from anywhere in the text to support your answer. So for example, when I see the fact that he is feeling amazed, okay, so I will give my evidence, which is going to be the line where he says, you aren't going to try to climb it, are you? So he shows a bit of shock or a little he's questioning more. He's questioning his decisions. He's not very
मैम
certain. Ji.
मैम मैं उनसे पूछता हूँ कि इसको मैं ऐसे ही कोट कर सकती हूँ या फिर इसको मुझे rephrase करना है या फिर अपने own words में लिखूँ?
That's the thing. When it's asking you to give details, वो आप quote करोगे.
Yes.
When it's asking you to explain, आप उसको explain करोगे. So, okay, let me just write down an answer for you so you know exactly what this is supposed to look like. So, for example, the first thing that I want to highlight is the fact that let's say the fact that he was angry. This is the feeling that I want to explain. Okay? So, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to identify the line that I can't watch. Okay? So, this line, or I could talk about how closed his eyes. So I will quote this line and talk about how Marwood felt extremely angry. I'm not going to use the word furious because I'm highlighting his feeling, which is that of anger, which I know because he used the word furious when he says, I can't watch. So I'll write how he says, I can't watch furiously, closing his eyes. And this example, after quoting it, I'll explain how Marwood was angry at Mo for the decision that he was making at this point. So I'm not going to be very elaborate with this. One line to quickly quote my detail, one detail from anywhere in the text to support my answer. So my first feeling was, for example, that of amazed. I explain how Marwood felt amazed by how he couldn't believe Mo was going to actually try to climb it. So this detail that he couldn't believe that he was actually going to try and climb it is something I took from the text. The word amazed is the feeling I associated with this example. Similarly, if I say that the feeling that I'm trying to highlight is the fact that he was nervous or worried, I will talk about how he said Marwood believes or warns Mo that he doesn't think that it's a very smart move that he's making, showing how nervous or worried he is. So the first mark I'm getting for identifying this part of the text that talks about how he calls his decision something not smart, not very smart. And what feeling did I associate with that? The fact that he's really worried about him, since it already says that he warned from below. So is pure context में I can say that he was worried or scared. He wasn't quite certain that this was a good idea. Okay, so to get both marks, what you're basically going to do is एक word आपका आ जाएगा to highlight that feeling, and then you give that detail from the text. Since it's a give question, the command word give basically implies that you basically produce an answer from the text lift out basically. जो आपने करना होता है. So you pick out one line and what feelings you associate with that from our word. In your own words, you explain that. Does that make sense now?
Yes.
Yeah. Anything else that you want to go over from section 1 before we move on?
No, ma'am, it's all clear.
I think no more questions here either. All right. Okay, so the next section that we will quickly go over, the easiest of the lot actually, in my opinion at least, is the summary question. Just a few pointers to keep in mind when going over the summary section. The question does not ask you to write a draft. You are not writing any points. You're not expected to formulate any draft before you actually write your summary, so do not do that. You are directly asked to summarize what would appeal most to guests about a stay at the Tree Hotel according to text B. So, text B basically talks about a night among trees, it's about a tree house hotel. You are to write in continuous form, so no note form. They've already mentioned that, so keep that in mind. Use your own words where appropriate. So there may be certain terms that you need to lift off from the text, for example, titles or words that you think are the only word you can use for that particular situation or to describe a particular thing from the passage. That's fine. But keep in mind that you are not expected to copy anything from the text. All right. Avoid copying long sections from the text. Your summary should be no more than 150 words. All right. So make sure that the word limit is very, very serious. Do not exceed the word limit by any amount of words whatsoever. So do not exceed the word limit. Make sure that no matter what, you are sticking to the word limit. Up to 10 marks are available for the content of your answer and up to 10 marks for the quality of writing. So I'm going to quickly go through this passage, identify the content points. Um, Usually आपको 5 to 10 मिल जाते content points within the text, which would highlight something that would appeal most guests. Sometimes you may have a text where you are expected to comprehend the information in order to answer this question. What that basically means is now in this case, it's saying what would appeal most to guests. So the way the passage is formulated, once you read that, you're basically trying to comprehend how the information could possibly highlight the idea of something that would make people want to stay in this particular hotel. So, for example, this is our text. I've already highlighted the points which are to be included within your summary. Talking about, for example, recently I watched a documentary film called The Tree Lover, all about the link between trees and people. In the film, director Jonas says, imagine relaxing here on summer evenings. So, the idea of this being a relaxing experience is one point that we can highlight within our summary. He's sitting in a tree house he spent months building, looking out over a wide forest lit by the setting sun. So, the idea that it's something relaxing, point number one. And guess what? It turns out you don't have to just imagine it. Since the Tree Hotel in northern Sweden opened last month, you too can live out your childhood dream and holiday in a tree house. The idea of how this is something that is associated with childhood memories. Second point, surveying the landscape. So, this is something that you could highlight as another point, the idea of being close to nature. A well hidden tree hotel is a creation of guest house owners, Britta and Kent, who were inspired by his film, Create the Back to Nature Retreat. The idea of being close to nature. Point number four. Where guests can switch off and breathe more deeply. This is again associated with relaxing, so we're not going to take this detail. An area of forest behind their treehouse had been sold for logging instead of waiting for the inevitable to happen in a country where forestry is such an important industry. Not necessary. They persuaded the forest's new owner to sell it to them. With help from various architect friends, they planned the innovative designs of the tree hotel. So, this is something that people could want to experience the innovative design. Determined to demonstrate that the natural forest environment had value beyond supplying timber. On arrival, I was greeted by Betta, who explained guests usually leave their luggage here and just take a small overnight back to the tree houses. We want them to get the feeling that they're leaving one world behind and entering another. So, the idea of being away from your everyday life, that's how I can rephrase this. Betta led me along a narrow path through a glade of birch trees, explaining as we walked why the couple wanted to share their passion for this beautiful forest environment with guests. We arrived at Mirror Cube, the most striking of the tree houses. It's a glass box perched high in the forest. It's an architectural magic. So the idea of how the architecture is something that enthusiasts could enjoy. The next thing inside the Mirror Cube, like the hotel's other tree houses, facilities are fairly basic, not stretching far beyond environmentally friendly. So the fact that this entire experience is environmentally friendly, so it's something that they can experience if they like nature very much. So don't need to talk about, we could talk about how there are basic facilities like heating. That's something that could be appealing for them. Moving forward, no one can see in, but you can, so there's privacy. I will rephrase this by highlighting the idea of how there is privacy. That's number 9. Um, there's even a window in the ceiling to look up into the sky. They can stargaze. That's number 10. One more thing to appeal. Sleep under the open sky can be associated with the idea of stargazing. And later over breakfast can talk enthusiastically about village walk tours. So the idea of how there are other facilities available as well. So that's 11 points in total that we have identified to talk about why this entire experience could be something that guests would enjoy. So for your summary, once you have actually identified all of these points, your task at hand is to simply highlight these points in your own words, club together ideas that you think would work best together. So, for example, if you're talking about amenities, from the fact that it has basic amenities, however, has heated flooring. So these are two things that I can club together into a complex sentence instead of two simple sentences so that I save more words. So this is basically what they mean by up to 10 marks for the quality of your writing. So if you're able to employ these techniques where you club together ideas to save words, you use the right synonym, you use the right adjective where it's required in order to describe what you're talking about, and you rephrase to the extent possible, that's what gets you the marks. So obviously the first 10 marks are available for the content. So if you're able to identify all of these points and reflect those within your summary, you get these 10 marks. Then the way you write these 10 points, that's the rest of the 10 marks. This is where your ability to use synonym comes in. So if you do not know a synonym for a word, try to describe it in simpler statements instead of trying to lift off from the text. So there are two things that you need to keep in mind when writing your summaries. Make sure you read the question very carefully, number one. Secondly, once you've identified all content points that you think would highlight the question at hand, rephrase those phrases. Use a word in place of what they've already said. So, for example, if they're talking about how the glass is not a two-way glass, people cannot look in, replace that with the idea of how it's a very private experience. So they do not have to worry about privacy. Similarly, when they're talking about how it is something that is surrounded with nature, talking about how nature lovers would enjoy being immersed within nature. Use words that are synonymous to the words given within the passage. So, the three things that you keep in mind when answering your summary question. Last, but definitely not the least, because this is something that is a new addition to the paper, is your short response question, where you will be given a scenario where you immerse yourself within the comprehension text. For example, in this case, imagine you are Kent, one of the owners of the hotel. You are interviewed by a local news program about the effect that hotels are having on the forest environment. So, again, they give you this in reference to how the overall comprehension passage is formulated, the summary passage, but again, leaves room for your implication as well. Give your answer to the reviewer's question using information from the text. So, basically, you have to keep in mind whatever you read within the passage, that's information that you have now. Using that information, you answer this question. So try not to deviate from the information given. Try not to say something that goes or contradicts completely to what you have read. Do not do that. Interviewer's question says, some local people think that your tree hotel might have a negative effect on our forest environment. What is your opinion and why? Now, the question at hand is, do you think that this individual, Kent, would actually agree with this idea? Do you think Kent would say that the tree hotel has a negative impact on the forest environment or not? That's your first test here, to be able to actually identify whether this individual would agree or disagree with the idea given at hand. Once you have identified that, the next thing that you do is you formulate a response in which you highlight reasons as to why. So, based on the way the structure, the passage has been formulated, we can be sure to say that Kent will not agree with this. Kent believes that the tree hotel will not have a negative effect because this individual has created this tree hotel because he believes this is actually having a positive effect on the forest environment. Now, you give reasons why you think so. The first reason that I could think of is initially how he has actually bought this land from someone who was going to cut down this forest in the first place. So he has saved the forest. That's one reason why I can say he would disagree with this idea. Talking about how the passage says environmentally friendly. That basically means that phrase highlights the idea that he is someone who values nature. So it is a very eco-friendly, sustainable treehouse. So how can this have a negative impact on the forest environment? Next, the activities that he has mentioned for the guests are activities that he believes, or anyone would agree, are activities that do not harm the environment in general. So again, that's point number 3 that we can include to highlight how Kent would not agree with the idea that this treehouse is having a negative impact on the forest environment. Keep in mind, whatever reasons you give have to be implied from within the text. So you will pick out details from the text to support the idea that Kent believes that the treehouse is not having or does not have a negative effect on the overall environment of the forest itself. All right, that wraps up the specimen paper. Just keep in mind that for the comprehension section, you are all expected to read the paper very, very carefully. Read through the questions, underline command words, look at the marks given for the paper, look at the individual marks for each question, because that will help you identify exactly how much information you're expected to include. Make sure that if you are asked to give in details in your own words, you always do so. If you're asked to give information, that means you quote from the text. So that's the only section where you're actually allowed to pick out information and quote as is from the text. So if it's an identify question, if it's a give question, give details or identify examples, that's where you lift off. Otherwise, try to avoid lifting off large passages from the text. Make sure you read the question carefully. Make sure you look at the command words, look at the question and the marks associated so that you include the right amount of information. Make sure that you read the context very carefully. If there are any words that you're not familiar with, the context is your friend here. Try to understand the overall context of the passage. Synonyms where necessary, try to use as many of those as possible for your summary for sure. Formulate as many complex sentences as you can for your summary. So try to club together ideas. Do not waste words in small, short sentences, simple sentences, because you will end up using more lines than you otherwise would have if you had clubbed together ideas. That being said, for paper 1, just keep in mind that the overall paper is expecting you to not only just comprehend what the passage is about, but also try to use your understanding of what the overall effect of language is. So if you're able to highlight that understanding within your responses, the examiner will give you marks. One suggestion that I would give for all the students who are preparing for the paper on Wednesday, do go over some of the previous 1123 papers and look at the way the questions are basically asking you for information. Because yes, the questions may not be formulated the same way that they are previously, but the overall information will definitely be reflected through that. So do practice those papers. Do go through the specimen paper before your exam. Look at the marking scheme and look at exactly what is acceptable and what isn't. So that's it from my side. Good luck to everyone. I will keep a check on the comments. If there's anything that you need to know, I'll be here on YouTube. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, and good luck for your paper.